Continuing Chapter 5, Government. You Can Make It Good, from You Can Change the World, The Christopher Approach by James Keller. Wherever this incident has been told, an unmistakable shudder of self-reproach shows itself in the faces of those who hear it. Deep down, inside themselves, people know that most of their country's troubles, as well as the world's, lie at their doorstep because of their failure to participate in bringing sound Christian values into the councils and governments of men. The godless who would take over the earth are always on the job. Too many otherwise good people merely complain about their misguided zeal, yet do nothing about it. All it comes down to, what has been said before, better light one candle, as that housewife did, than to curse the darkness. Better to bear Christ into the marketplaces of the world than fret and fume over those with evil ideas who are there even now, selling their plan for global conquest, selling their blueprint for the eventual destruction of our free, God-given way of life and of our civilization. Everywhere, the situation is the same. Well, we can bring a light of good and truth and value without passing on possession. And certainly those who aren't talking about being possessed by Christ aren't exactly godless. I mean, very few of them are. And if you'd find godless in certain ways, maybe less likely be godless. Who knows? Well, not who knows, but a Frenchman, a former member of the Chamber of Deputies, who has been in the thick of the fight against communism in this country for the past 15 years, recently visited the United States, discussing the inroads of subversion in his own land and the need for the application of the Christopher idea. He urged the latter to be expanded on a huge scale over here. I see the same trend developing in the U.S., he said, which is now far more advanced in France, namely that the anti-Christian forces are slowly but surely taking over due to the neglect of the mass of good folk who do no more than take care of themselves. This Frenchman went on to assert that the elimination of religion from education and public life in his country, and the lack of acknowledgement of man's relationship to God since the turn of the century, has prepared the way for the present mess, with religion too often shunted aside and a void to be filled in its place. Communism, he said, has been the only force making a vital, unrelenting bid for this country's leadership, with the result that millions of people unwittingly rallied to it as a kind of religion. Now, I would say the emergence of mass media was probably a more likely candidate to have been doing that and continue to be doing that. At least 5 million out of the 5,600,000 who voted the communist ticket in a recent election, according to him, should not be regarded as Reds. They were simply sour, angry, disillusioned, and confused people. Sheep without a shepherd, people searching for someone to give them hope and finding none, save the godless, interested in their plight. To this observation he added, on the one hand, the right has never taken the interest it should in the working man. It gave charity, but not justice. On the other hand, far too many decent Frenchmen, estimates run as high as 5 million, either neglected are deliberately refrained from interesting themselves in their government. They did not vote. Their excuse was that they wanted no part in what they called dirty politics. So the Reds, who had no such strange timidity, capitalized on their short-sighted errors. He did something about it. Everything the Frenchman said has been borne out by reports from other sources telling virtually the same tragic story. But in this otherwise gloomy picture, the light of one man's candle of faith and the lights of others like him have already started to illuminate the darkness of his country. This very Frenchman, this ex-deputy, now turned businessman, was himself responsible in no small way for helping swing the trend in the right direction, as is evident from the following account received not from him, but from an American just returned from France. It seems this very effective French Christopher purchased an automobile in order to travel from town to town on business. The only car he could secure was a Chevrolet. Wherever he stopped, he noticed that the groups of workers indoctrinated by the communists made it their business to embarrass him, ridiculing him in public for having sold out to the American imperialists by buying one of their automobiles. This man decided to make the best of a bad situation in true Christopher fashion. In each town, he would sit quietly in his car until the inevitable large, hostile crowd gathered. Then, he would make his voice heard in a most disarming way. "I know how you men feel, but I don't think you realize that this Chevrolet automobile, along with the Ford and Plymouth, is the working man's car in the United States. Millions of workers like you in America own automobiles like this. They don't work any harder than you, but they live a lot better. I was there a few months ago, I know. I've seen them. Most of you should own a car like this. And you would if all of us would only learn more from America." Each time he said this, the look of hostility on the faces of the workers would change to one of amazement, mingled with disillusionment. The same haunting look that all men have when they eventually learn how they have been double-crossed by the Reds. For the first time, they have come face to face with the truth. Through the words of a fellow countryman, if 1,000,000 other voices like his were heard on the highways and byways of Europe, and of the whole earth, the hatred generated by subversion would begin to give way to better understanding of and more respect for truth. If not your job, whose? Meanwhile, in country after country all over the world, the design for godless conquest of all mankind follows its sinister pattern. In the United States, the subversives' success has been increasingly great due to the widespread indifference of so many otherwise good people who often make the excuse, like the 5 million Frenchmen who did not vote, that they want no trick with the dirty politics, forgetting that politics, in its purest definition, is the art and science of government. The results of a Gallup poll conducted recently showed that 67% of American parents do not want their children to go into politics, one of the reasons being that the whole field of politics is bad. Well, even today, I think there's maybe 1% of the major politicians that are decent people. However, 21% of the parents held it that unless people with good ideas do go into politics and into government, democracy will die. Well, America was never a democracy, so it shows what they know about politics. In the first group, it is painfully obvious, are those who do not participate actively in whatever pertains to the running of this country. They concern themselves very little with primary, state, or national elections. They seldom run for public office. Witness, for example, the Minnesota newspaper headline, 5 declined to run for municipal post, which captioned the story of 5 St. Paul attorneys who refused to be candidates for a municipal court judgeship. Too often theirs is the characteristic American attitude toward government and even towards the subversive threat to undermine it. Americans are aware of the threat, at least dimly, yet they have done too little about it. Like the crowds in New York who, in years past, remained on the sidelines when the communists took over on May Day, a gigantic loyalty parade dwarfed the Red Show of power this year. Their tolerance, if other than apathy, has been one of amused tolerance. And quoting Newsweek magazine, they stood by idly while the communists marched from victory to victory in the world. Yes, they stood by idly. And in their failure to work as hard for our democracy as those are working who would destroy it, they contributed to the spread of a doctrine which denies the existence of God and the position of man, dignified as he is by being created in the divine image. As Claire Booth Luce, author and ex-congresswoman, pointed out not long ago in This Week magazine, if the day ever comes when the men and women of our Western civilization desert completely the historic concept of man as a child of God with a free will and an immortal soul, and each of those things can be believed in separately, if the day comes, in short, when we too go over to scientific materialism, on that day, not all our oil or gold in the ground, nor our assembly lines, nor our Air Force, nor our navies, nor even our sole possession of the atomic bomb shall save us. On that day, freedom will perish in the totalitarian night of the world. And the next section, to get down to cases. And, well, ascribing limits to divinity, like saying that God has a child or a parent or has a gender or something like this. We can't say these things are historic. And if we tie it back tens of thousands of years, the indications that people believe these things about divinity back then too, various systems of rulership would have been under that guise. And what about Europe? All those kingships in Europe, the whole SPQR thing, if it got translated over, it's still SPQR. Generally speaking, when an individual in America thinks of himself in connection with government, his chief concern is with the question of whether or not he wishes to be a politician. Actually, however, every one of you is deeply involved in and affected by the process of government, whether you realize it or not. Every time you pay a sales tax, get a ticket for parking or speeding in your car, or fill out an income tax blank, you are involved with government. Every time you go before a labor board as an employer or as an employee, every time you collect unemployment insurance or old age security benefits or workman's compensation, you are involved with the government. Every time you see fire, police, or sanitation departments in operation, you're watching government in action. It is difficult indeed to think of any human activity in our modern society where the impact of government is not felt. Well, there are different types of functions of government, right? And some of what we listed is socialist. But is that the overall government? No. Obviously, then, you need not be a politician to be concerned with the legislative, judicial, and executive behavior of your nation. Governments are instituted among men to secure the rights given to you by your Creator. well, often people establish governments or gangs or whatever to take rights more than whatever, although that's not really the word they're putting on it. It's more about their own personal interests. But through governments, you can place under popular control those institutions which will protect you against a willful, evilly purposeful minority, and which will further your common aims and aspirations. The greatest ills of many nations have arisen from the fact that people are not sufficiently interested in their government. Public apathy encourages official corruption. Failure to use the rights bestowed by democracy advances the rapid growth of dictatorship. If people as a whole withdraw from the arena of politics, then selfish and tyrannical minorities can and do monopolize the great powers of government. To illustrate, suppose for a moment that our nation were a community of 100 instead of some 140 millions, and suppose that these 100 people had no government at all. It would then be possible for half a dozen men of ill will, prototypes of our modern gangster, to arm themselves with brass knuckles, clubs, and guns, to terrorize the entire community, to deny the entire community the right to live as free people. The power of the gangster to take over is not some mythical concept. This has happened in many American cities, where organized gangs have joined with self-seeking politicians in running whole communities, looting the public treasury, disregarding the public interests for the benefit of the gang and its cronies in office. The gang has taken over whole nations. Still, fresh in people's minds is the example of the NSDAP in Germany. The Hitler movement started with armed gangs, street ruffians, beat up people, and broke up peaceful meeting places. The shock troops and the storm troops and the gigantic open-air spectacles were an enlargement of that gang idea. Finally, the National Socialist German Worker Party seized power and used government not to secure the right of the German citizenry, but to destroy those God-given rights. That's, of course, an oversimplification. That talking about it like that puts it at a threat of rising again. It does. They gotta, give a balanced way of speaking about it to not over below the one side. But anyways, still tragically fresh in our memory also is the way in which the communists proceeded to convert once democratic Czechoslovakia into a police state. A pattern of conversion followed in every country in which they have seized control, as an editorial in a New York newspaper, PM, reported. In Czechoslovakia, the communists are now repeating exactly the methods they used to grab Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. It is a pattern of conquest through political terror and chicanery, worked out to the last detail. The formula, which so far has been foolproof, is as follows. Become part of a government legally by forming a coalition with socialists, liberals, and other parties willing to travel along. This step might be described as the foot in the door. Insist that a communist be a minister of justice. This happened in Bulgaria. Naidanov and Romania, Patrascanu. The Ministry of Justice controls the courts, which means the opposition secretly earmarked for elimination will get no break. 1 foot over the threshold. Demand the Minister of War be a communist. This took place in Romania. General Laskar. In Bulgaria, General Demyanov, and in Czechoslovakia, General Svoboda, a communist minister of war dominating the armed forces, is a guarantee that an effective uprising against the communist would be impossible. Both feet are in. Obtain control over the Ministry of Interior, which in European countries is in charge of the police forces. The Czechoslovakia Minister of Interior, Václav Nosek, is a communist who has been filling key posts with the communists, intimidating non-communists, forcing out anti-communists, both feet over the threshold and a gun in hand. While there's a lot more force in that side, the NSDAP came to power through elections and promising rights and stuff like this, and a lot of it they just weren't capable of, but some of it they did the opposite of what people thought they were going to do. Put a communist or pro-communist in the Ministry of Information. This takes care of censorship, paralyzes press and radio criticism, and prepares a favorable climate of opinion. In Bulgaria and Romania, the ministers of information were pro-communists. In Czechoslovakia, the minister, Václav Kopecki, is in charge of press, radio, movies, and the allocation of newsprint. Gun in one hand, chloroform in the other. Once these key posts are filled and personal security installed and organized, a number of moves followed with machine-like precision. Intimidate the press by closing some opposition newspapers, threatening strikes in the plant, arrest editors, discredit the parliamentary and other opposition by accusing them of being foreign agents, plotters, and saboteurs, arrest the opposition leadership, try them publicly, and then destroy the parties by disbanding or absorption. There it is, a blueprint for power used by the godless, and that blueprint can be applied to the United States, hastened along by the apathy of the people with regard to their government. Past 5 years seen a lot of the accusations against even government, particularly government officials of, per se, the other party, of the person making the people making the accusations, towards that sort of thing. While the nation sleeps, the totalitarians bore their way into one post after another. When the opportune time comes, they reach out for total power. Meanwhile, there has been no dearth of diagnoses on the subject. However, the fact still remains that so far, too many experts have done more to define this disease in our modern society than they have taken steps to halt its freedom-sapping inroads. Now, one of the things that you could say is that people with certain theological bents are going to say, well, what about the afterlife or this? If the world lets me get away with it, I haven't got away with it in my own life on the personal side, the interior side, the afterlife, whatever. So people looking at that, they're going to go like, yeah, I have to be completely honest and all that stuff. Of course, I have a program on Christian lying. So there is Christian grounds for deceit. So when does that become acceptable? In a nation such as ours, founded on the recognition of man's God-given rights and his eternal relationship to his Creator, founded more firmly on these basic truths than on any other nation on the face of the earth, such apathy and indifference are inexcusable. Face keeps getting hit in the jacket. I'm not sure if that hurts my sound here. One main characteristic of the democracy, which is our republic, is the belief in the inalienable rights of the individual. A second characteristic is the belief in the necessity for democratic control of political and economic life. These two articles of faith constitute the foundation of our democratic tradition. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., Associate Professor of History at Harvard University, puts this thought into words in an address given at the third annual New York Herald Tribune High School Forum, held at the Waldorf Astoria in New York not long ago. The belief in the inalienable rights of the individual is an 18th century reinstatement of the Christian faith in the integrity and indestructibility of the soul. Mr. Schlesinger said, "It is an affirmation of the individual against the mob, of man against the state. Its charter is the Bill of Rights." Its charter is the Bill of Rights. That is the first 10 amendments, without which people refuse to ratify the American Constitution. Especially, it is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, of abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The basic issue in the world today, in short, Mr. Schlesinger continued, is between those who believe in human freedom and those who believe in the police state. If we narrow the base of our support by excluding those with whom we have merely economic disagreements, we enormously weaken the moral strength of a position based unequivocally on the dignity of man, and we end by reducing our own side and transferring allies to the communists. A free society is not a perfect society. Given the Christian conception of man, we would hardly expect perfection on this earth. Because what, you don't even try? Well, I mean, you try to do good, I'm not saying that, but it's like other faiths talk about a perfected individual. Not that their work's done, but like perfecting, A free society is a society in which individuals are free to define perfection and struggle toward it. The United States is not utopia, but because it is not utopia, we do not have to decide that it is, therefore, a mass of hypocrisy. Well, you don't have to decide. Sure, you're not being forced to decide, but in a way you sort of are. If you decide not to decide, then you're not doing your work but, it is hypocrisy if there's ideas and ideals that should be had and you're kind of not upholding them. So, yeah. Because this to err is human stuff is like, well, fine, yeah, but that doesn't excuse it, We, as a nation, have our faults, but these faults are small indeed, compared with the deliberate pattern of personal and public falsehood, public chicanery, and godless propaganda of the totalitarian. America is beset today with many vital problems, said Speaker Joseph W. Martin, Jr. of the House of Representatives in a Memorial Day address at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, recently. But America has had problems before. We have met them in our true American way and emerged each time stronger than ever. These problems have been met and will continue to be met by strong leadership and common unity among the people. There are all too many in our own country ready to betray the sacrifices which have been made by our hallowed dead, overthrow this country by stealth, if possible, and by force and violence, if necessary. Over the years, they crept into high places in our government. When we seek to curb their seditious activities, the subversionists seek refuge under the same Constitution and the same Bill of Rights they are attempting to destroy. The Founding Fathers never intended the Constitution should be a cloak over those who would overturn the government of this nation. Communists and fellow travelers who infested the government service must be driven out. There is no room on the federal payroll for anyone whose loyalty is to another nation. But perhaps people who are loyal to principles that quite haven't been put in for this country. But people working against the country, yeah, that has no role. Certain things the country is doing, sure, but the country, no. Note, it has been estimated that about 400 communists hold positions of importance in Washington. Others occupy strategic positions in the military government abroad. The communist-dominated United Public Workers of America claim membership of 100,000, of whom 40,000 are federal workers. While it cannot properly be said that all members of this union are communists, it is undeniable that they are all subject to communist propaganda and pressure. The conclusion to be drawn from these remarks is only too obvious, that these subversives believe anything they like, but by the same token, don't let them be put on our government's payroll, where they work unceasingly to wreck everything for which America stands. Don't let them be like the 101 State Department employees who were recently the subject of an exhaustive investigation by the federal security agents, including the best FBI operatives in the business, and were adjudged poor security risks. To quote from the Congressional Record, April 26, 1948, on communist infiltration in the State Department, the Honorable Edward J. Devitt, representative from Minnesota, reporting. And again, quoting from the Congressional Record at the same date. One of the things that we could look at, though, is that it's not so much communists and whatnot, but it is, it seems like there's more major politicians in line with Russia and China on one political party than America. Although some of these people, they didn't care about their own religion's laws. The nations where some of them or their parents came from, or,